making the time out to actually be here. And I know it's a busy weekend for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's my pleasure. It was so great meeting you, and that's.
I know,
Yeah.
we kicked it off right away. I'm like, okay, I need to get on the show. I'm like, I want to save everything that you were telling me for today, just so that other people can get to, hear your story as well, and actually help shed light on this topic. So while we're actually waiting for more people to tune in, why don't you tell the people that are on here already a little bit about you? I mean, I could read your whole resume, but I'd rather talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and that's actually great because my notes are loading as well. So,
okay.
So y'all, hey, my name is Brittany Claybrooks. I am a Detroit native. I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. I went on to go to Florida A&M for undergrad college, and then where I graduated with a degree in healthcare management and administration. And then I left there to go work for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation with Nancy Pelosi's office.
Okay.
And then I left that to do Obamacare and do enrollment in Virginia. And then after that, I went along to, after the administration ended and it was time to go and whatever, I decided I would go back to grad school where I now study urban planning and development. My focus is housing and economic development, and I do a lot of research around how cities changed and the growth and decline between 1979 and 2008, particularly in Detroit, because Detroit was a place that saw that kind of fluctuation. But I do believe for me that the crack epidemic had a lot to do with it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Oh, wow. Sounds good. I mean, she's actually being a little modest, you guys. Her resume is way longer than what she just talked about. But I am so honored and glad to have you on the show. And, let's really dive into it. I know you have a busy weekend, so
yeah, but I have as much time. Listen, I'm going to sit here as long as we need to sit here because this is an important issue.
It is.
I'm checking in a day early, so I'm fine.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, just to get started, right? Why don't we talk a little bit? What is, talk to us a little bit what the opioid crisis is and what the crack epidemic in the 80s and 90s was all about.
Okay, so, we have today, I actually just want to mention that the opioid crisis it's a very hot topic here in the United States, right now, because even Donald Trump, when he first came in office, he said, I'm going to crack down on the opioid epidemic. And this morning, he proposed legislation around, putting the death penalty out on drug dealers who decide that they want to, sell drugs, opioid drugs and whatever. Right. And it's been more of a health issue in the 2000s. Because it started to really affect white people in a negative way, right? So, you did have the crystal meth situation, but it was affecting it was only known as the white, rural, poor drug, right? And it was the white version of what crack was doing in the black communities. And then now you have, last year, 64,000 people died from, opioid, overdoses alone. And so it ends up being the leading killer now, as the CDC classifies it as the leading killer of, people under 50. Well, opioids are not a new drug to the United States, right? We saw in the 80s where, people, it was flying through black communities, especially those who have been depressed by riots. I talk a lot about Detroit because that's where a lot of my context comes from. Right. But it flew through black poor communities like wildfire. And that people really don't talk about that, but that was also through the efforts of the United States government, right? And as long as it was more so on black folks, and as long as it was, those people over there in the ghetto and it was a black thing, for some of us, it was a way of life, right? It was people coming up who were already poor, and they found this drug that they could sell to make a way for their families and whatever. And so it began to kind of sweep through our neighborhoods. And when it was us and it was crack and it was cheap and it was synthetic, it was a crime. And we have mandatory minimums and we got to lock people up, and they're super predators. And all these community leaders, black and white, people who are black in skin, but more so diplomatic in thought, also gathered around, you know, our white lawmakers to say, you know what, we have to knock this out. So we're putting sentences on, you know, people and sending them away from jail.
Jake had actually asked the death penalty for drug dealers, like in the Philippines. We already know that Trump admires the president of the Philippines a lot. So he's really trying to model, you know, what they've done in the past.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know what is interesting? Because I haven't really heard anybody call it the war on drugs. And I think that back then it was, let's lock folks up and put them in a cage and kind of submit them to like slave labor in prison. But now that the drug and the people who deal it are killing white kids and rich white people, we have to kill them, because we have to kill anybody who is like, you know, anybody who is, you know, affecting our communities and the things that we hold true and that we hold value to. And I think that's really what this is about.
How would you say, I mean, why do we think this is overwhelmingly white, and why do we think that, and how is it affecting the Latino and Black community?
So it's overwhelmingly white. So let me just point out for you a few numbers. So I told you earlier that, you know, it was the leading cause of death for people under 50. Right, 50. And then last year we saw 64,000 deaths. Well, out of all of those, 49, about 50,000 of those deaths came from what people call fentanyl, heroin, and prescription opioids. Well, those are drugs that are typically used by richer white people. They're more expensive. Even though fentanyl is like a prescription drug, it's almost like a synthetic opioid. It's a synthetic prescription opioid. And a lot of people who use those particular drugs, those are classified as like white upper echelon drugs, right? And so the crisis that they're tackling is not crack, it's not cocaine, it's not crystal meth. Even though people die from those too, it's more so the things that are attacking richer white people, right? And I think that with, as far as like the opioid crisis and what, you know, Black and Latino people, like, you know, as far as Black and Latino folks and how it's affecting us, it's actually really funny because racism has almost spared us from this particular movement. And the reason why I say that, the reason why I say that is because, so I was reading, right? I was reading an NPR. So, you know, I've done a lot of research on this over time, and I was reading a NPR report, right? And it was talking a lot about, they deferred it to a drug abuse expert who was Andrew D. Kolodny. He's a doctor. And he was talking about how, you know, when people, because of the crack epidemic and the precedents it set and the prejudice it put towards Black people and drugs and Latino people and drugs, doctors are more hesitant to give. And we learned a lot about this too in undergrad when I was studying healthcare administration, about healthcare disparities and discrimination in the doctor's office. When if you were a Black person or a brown person and you're in pain and something's going on, doctors are inherently a little bit more hesitant to give you an opioid, like a morphine or anything with opioids in it, because they fear that you're addicted, right? Because drugs and Black folks and brown bodies were stigmatized for so long that racism has spared us in this movement,
a lot of
right?
sense. Yeah.
Right, it has spared us a lot in this movement. So we're not dying as much from, you know, the opioids today as we were back then. And we're also not dying from it as much as we are at the hands of like violence or just chronic diseases that come from just our lifestyles and like living in the United States and having high stress lifestyle. So again, this is very much a race thing. I believe it's a race thing. I think that for me, and
for people tuning in, if you're just joining us, welcome. We are talking about the opioid crisis and the crack epidemic back in the 80s and 90s. Please leave your input, because I will be looking at them and addressing them as well. So please leave whatever input you have in the comment section as well. So,
and also, I'm going to actually take my headphones out and put my charger in because I don't want my phone to.
Okay.
So can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah. So talk to us a little bit. One of the questions that I know I was going to address with you today is the way the government responded to the crack epidemic back in the 80s and 90s. They called it the double down on war on drugs. And of course, the Congress passed a law back then. about the 100-to-1 law. We know that that predominantly affected the Black communities. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
So,
and tell us, for people that don't know what the 100-to-1 law is, please enlighten us.
Okay, so the 100-to-1 law. So a lot of it was, if I'm not mistaken, the 101 law was really, a lot of those laws were centered around like mandatory minimums. It was around, if you were caught with just like one, like 1 ounce,
1
just
gram,
a little bit of crack, one gram, right? Like that could be 100 years for you, right? And like that could be a long time in jail.
Even if it was your first offense.
Even if it was your first offense for non-violent crimes, you could be just, trying to get your fix right, because we know that people who are addicted to opioids are sick. So for them, crack would be sort of like a medicine. So you could be an addict who's suffering from a real problem, a real issue, and just have 1 gram and you in jail for a long time. They were really locking people up. And so for me, I use my city, Detroit, Michigan, to really illustrate what really happened during this era. I was affected by it, honestly. I was born addicted to drugs. That's not a secret for a lot of people who I share my story to. My father was on drugs, in and out of prison. My mom, same thing. Foster care was at an all-time high during the 80s and 90s for Black children in inner city cities. I was a foster child for most of my childhood. I was emancipated at 17 later on, but I was in foster care and was later adopted later on. And so there's that personal side to it, where a lot of us living today are in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, and nobody has addressed us. Nobody has talked about the hurt, the health, and all those things that we went through.
Right.
But even on a more academic level, Detroit, for example, they saw a heavy population decrease in between 80 and 2000, right? So the total decrease was 61.6% of its population had left the city between 1979 and 2000. And 42.6% of that population was between 1980 and 2000. And we know that the crack era is between 80 and like 98, right? And so whether that was because people were leaving because there were no jobs, whether people were leaving and being taken off the census because they were prisoners, or whether people were leaving because they were dying of the violence that was happening as a result of this, right? And so that's just a snippet, and that's just one city, but it happened in Newark and New York and, all these cities that we now see as like these gold mines for redevelopment. The crack era created that gold mine. The crack era created that, destitute city where there's a lot of land to be developed, right? And so I think that when people talk about this issue, they have to talk about it in a more realistic way, right? Like, this was a lifestyle for a lot of us. This was a lifestyle for a lot of our families. You had people who were depressed by the manufacturing jobs going out to the suburbs and what we call suburbanization, and Black people not being able to even live in the suburbs. So now you have to stay in the inner city. There are no jobs, or little to no jobs. You're underworked. And then there's this drug being put here because the United States is working with some Nicaraguans, and they decide that they're going to put drugs in Black communities. Well, for the poor person trying to eat, and they seeing somebody on the corner who's making money and they want to eat and they're surviving, people don't want to see their community on drugs. But what can I do if I got to eat? If I got to make a way, right? You had two-sided coins. You had people trying to escape from what was going on, and you had people trying to make money and make a living. And all of that was happening with people in the same community that looked like each other, right? And then you have people...
somebody has a question. Somebody is asking, what race predominantly is selling opioids for the president to want the death penalty for who's selling them?
White. It's totally white. It's 100%. It's so if 64,000 people have died, right? 49,000 of those deaths have came from the upper echelon of opioid, meaning that it's being used by rich people, rich white folks. It's not even a white rural issue. They're not even trying to attack it for people in rural communities that are poor and using crystal meth. They want to target it for the people that is hurting now, which is rich white people under 50. Now, when it starts hitting that kind of home and it starts hitting that kind of thing, the conversation goes from let's lock people up and it goes from like let's ruin the lives and criminalize people who are doing it in the black communities in the 80s and 90s. And now let's start killing off the people who are killing the people we hold true and near and dear to America. And that's rich, educated, rich white people.
Well, before Trump made his declaration today and the one he made last year, what were the penalties for people that are being caught? Do they even try to track them down?
So it depends. It depended on what the drug was. So you can get more time for having crack than powder cocaine, right? So if you were caught with crack, that jail sentence was a little bit steeper, and the mandatory minimum was more than likely to be applied than if you were caught with like cocaine or, you know, an opioid in its like rarest form. Well, we know that the crack and the synthetic drugs are the cheaper things that black and brown people use or rural white people use versus the upper echelons, cocaine and heroin in their purest form. That's a little bit more expensive, meaning that's being bought by more privileged people. And that's the drug of the suburbs. Yeah. So drugs of the suburbs, you get a slap on the wrist, it's a federal crime, blah, blah, blah. Versus crack, like you can go away for a while for that. And nobody's addressing the fact that you may be addicted. Or poverty is the issue, right? Like crime and drugs are not the issues in black communities. It's poverty and like systematic oppression and systematic like discrimination in living situations, right? Where we couldn't own homes in the suburbs. And so we were concentrated in these cities that were heavily devastated. And now bringing it back to 2018 and, you know, in the last 5 years or so, DC is an example of like, or New York City or Manhattan are examples of cities being turned around, but were devastated and destroyed by the crack era. Right? But now they're being turned around. Nobody's addressing the era that created these like windows of opportunity for people to develop. Nobody's talking about how the homes got abandoned in Detroit, or how the cities were destroyed in Newark, or how the Bronx became to be what it was, and how all of these apartment buildings are being used as crack operations that were put here by the government. We didn't go get them ourselves, right? And, and they put it there because there was no police oversight. There was a lot of divestment in these communities, and so they were able to get away with it, you know?
So with what you do, how, based on your research, how has any kind of drug issue in the black community, how has that been addressed? Or how can we go about sort of addressing that? Because, I mean, opioid right now seems like such a big deal, and we know why. But nothing that concerns the black people in anything is being addressed properly. So what can we really do to start addressing those kind of issues?
So this question is what we call, or this issue or this problem is what we call like a wicked problem. And wicked problems are in urban planning those problems that we can't solve, right? So in urban planning, there are problems like affordable housing and discriminatory lending and predatory lending and, people not abiding by the Fair Housing Act, poverty. Where do you put a school versus where do you put a market rate apartment? And those are problems that are very hard to solve. And we call them wicked problems because they don't have definitive answers, right? It looks one way in 2008, like in Detroit, it looked one way in 2008 as the economy was crashing. It looks different now that the car industry has been bailed out and it's automated. So that's a wicked problem that has to be addressed differently at every stage and at every time it manifests itself. But I think now, looking at this issue, luckily, it's not our issue. As far as like we're not dying from the kind of drugs that they're attacking. Yeah. For the first time, but I do believe that it'll have an effect in the sense that if this starts to become a black issue, then I believe that the death penalty and all those hard penalties are going to be geared more towards the black people that are doing it. Right? If they're not going to enforce it on anybody, they are for sure going to enforce it on us. And I really think that a couple of the ways that we can start to address this problem is recognizing that the opioid crisis and the crack epidemic are, I call it, same issue, separate America, right? It happened before. We saw this before. And here's a clear picture of how it's happening different when it comes to white folks, right? So there's a clear thing there. So as black folks, we have to understand and acknowledge that this is different. Right? This is a different time. It's the same thing that happens to us. White folks are just tired of it. Same thing with gun violence and all the other issues. So I think that as we approach the issue, we have to acknowledge the damage that it did, kind of like you and I did here today. Acknowledge that, people's lives were ruined because of this entire decade of crack. And also talk about demand that the same treatment of like it being a health issue for other communities that lack melanin.
Yeah.
Understand that crack is an opioid as well. It's a form of an opioid. It's a form of cocaine. And that if somebody has crack, you're going to have to now take away that policy and address them, as a health patient. So if a part of Trump's proposal is that, if you're caught with this opioid, we're going to bring the health department in and we're going to treat people and we're going to send them to treatment and whatever, you also have to understand that if you catch somebody with crack in the middle of Brightmo or in the middle of a neighborhood in Detroit, Brightmo is a neighborhood in Detroit, or North End where I'm from, if you catch somebody with that kind of thing, why aren't you, let's hope that they're sending them to
show them compassion.
And let's hope that, the same New York Times article that, spewed out numbers of compassion and spewed out words of compassion for, the folks over in the suburbs, of Michigan and the suburbs of New York and all these other places. Let's hope that they're showing that same level and the policy is relating to people who are on crack or meth. Because those are the poor drugs. Those are the drugs that poor people are using. And, let's see. I would be interested to see if the CDC is going to keep up with the numbers on how many people are admitted to, rehabs who are on crack and meth versus how many people in the next 5 years under this law, if it's proposed, are going to be admitted, right? And so there you'll be able to see, like, how the disparity is playing out, or if the law is doing what it quote-unquote says it's supposed to do. I doubt that it will, because I understand that this is a white rich issue. But if it's not, it'll become like a low-hanging fruit, right? And it'll become a way for us to start to ask, can we start expunging some of these small non-violent drug offenses? Can we start, exonerating?
Well, we know how that's going to go. The pushback, the pushback,
We know how it's going to go, but I think that as Black folks, for Black folks doing this work, we have to now stop, as I laid out the issue very well today, but I think we have to stop, Black and brown folks have to stop, like, we understand that it's an issue, we understand that it's a thing, and we understand that it's fair, but the best way to tackle it is to let it go through, right? And then start lobbying some of our folks like, hey, so if you now know that opioid is a health problem, let's talk about folks that's in jail for this little bitty offense. You know what I mean? For this 1 gram, this 1 to 100 law. So what this is going to create is like a.
So can we start by can we bring an issue like this to like politicians in our local communities, like start addressing it with them, writing them, calling them, stuff like that? Okay.
Absolutely, and I think honestly, we now celebrate the birth of like the Black politician, right? The Barack Obamas, the Cory Bookers. We now can celebrate that we have more Black politicians in office today. I think it's high time now that we're starting to see these kind of things happen. I think it's high time that we start holding some of those, some of them accountable, because their representation as a color is no longer enough, right? And they see this happening, and they're making laws, and it's not even federal; it's more local, right? Like, what do your local laws say? How is local law enforcement handling the dope dealers or the crack dealers or whoever? How are they handling it? And that matters, right? How are they handling their city's crack problem or their city's opioid problem? And let's hope that in Black communities we can start mobilizing our local leaders to say, yo. You know what I'm saying? Let's open up a treatment center. We got all this property that people trying to develop on. Let's open up a treatment center for people. And let's get rid of that stigma, and let's stop throwing people in jail. But I think they have to transition from talking points to actually tackling the low-hanging fruit, which is, people are...
Someone is saying Black people will have to start to vote for politicians, to matter to politicians. I mean, Black people do vote, I guess.
Okay, so, honestly, and I hate to push back on that, I hate to push back on that because I am the first to critique us when we're not doing right. I'm the first to talk about Hispanic people and brown people and Black people and red people and everybody that has melanin, I'm the first to jump on us when we need to do better. But we have been carrying elections for a long time. Black women have carried the last election. We continue to carry those elections, But it's one thing to get people through to the polls. It's another thing to be in their office Monday morning, the Monday after they take office, and say, you know what? Listen, let's stop criminalizing these people. You know, for me, you know, even more personally, I have a mom that's still, to this day, you know what I'm saying, struggling with that. Hey, Mom, I hope you're watching. I love you so much. But she struggled with it for a long time, and I'm very proud of her. I'm very proud of, like, how long she lived, right? But I understand both sides of it, and I understand that this drug and drugs have destroyed our community, but I also understand that it's a health issue. You know, it's a health thing. It's a problem. It's a health thing, and I think that it's a policy issue that is equally black as it is white. Right now, it's just being addressed as like the white killer, but it's a black crime. When it's black people, it's crime. When it's white folks who are not,
people, it's a crisis.
It's a killer. Oh my God, let's go kill the people who are killing white people. You know,
right.
We have to stop that. So we need to start framing it like, okay, let them have that. Let them have this movement. Let them pass as many laws as they need to pass about treating people. And the minute that law passes for them to start treating people, let's go start rounding up people that are on crack and taking them to treatment centers. Right? And that's how you really fight back, for me. Right?
Yeah, and Isaac with the random hour is saying once weed is legalized, all this drug problem will go away. I doubt it, though, Isaac.
Yeah, that's not true because, right, and then they're going to monopolize on weed. Like weed, prime example, weed, right? They're going to monopolize on weed. If you have a felony, you cannot own or work in a dispensary. So if you have a drug felony from weed back in the day, you're an expert. Who better to talk to than people who have been selling drugs their whole life?
Right.
But if you now have a felony for the same thing they're legalizing, you cannot own a dispensary in some states. In Michigan, you can't even be caught working in one. In any of our dispensaries, you cannot work in a dispensary in Michigan. Right? And so all of the drug problems are not going to go away because you still have people who have spent 20 and 30 years in jail and now they're getting out. And the very thing that they made a living off of and the very thing they knew how to do, they can no longer even participate in now that it's illegal because they have felonies.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah, Jake is also still pushing back on the voting thing. He says black voter rates in red states is very low. Those are places where they need to vote the most. People would not be going to jail in Ferguson for a parking ticket if they were properly represented. So I mean, we understand work still needs to be done in the red states.
I work in the South, so I got my political start in Tallahassee, Florida, North Florida, Gunshine State, Florida, okay? That's where I got my start. And in Florida, if you have a felony, you cannot vote. In Florida, we know that and I also work for the Juvenile Justice Department as well. So I can't even begin to talk to you about the number and the disparity of black and brown people locked up in the southern states. You get out, I
think most states, if you have a felony, you can't vote. I think that's for most states,
in Michigan, you can, right? Like, you know, when my parents got out of prison, they were ready to vote for Obama. You know, they restore your rights. So there's 20 some odd states where you cannot vote if you have a felony, or I think either it's 20 some odd states where you cannot vote if you have a felony, or 20 some states where you can. Either way, there are some states where you can and some states where you cannot. A lot of the southern states and a lot of red states don't give voting rights to people who have felonies. And the thing about that is that there are actual coalitions that are solely built on getting people who have felonies the right to vote, or who have charges the right to vote, because that's a form of voter suppression, and that's also a way to keep those states red. Because if everybody who suffered from an issue that was opposite of the Republican Party and opposite of what the Republican Party stands for, those states will easily be blue, right? And purple states would then turn over to be blue. So that's a form of voter suppression. ID laws at the ballot, right? People show up at the ballot and, oh my God, you don't have this form of ID, right?
You can't vote,
and you know that it costs $20, $25 to get an ID. If you show up to vote and you're homeless and you have an address, or you're using an address or whatever, you can't vote, right? There's so many stipulations around having the right to vote. Some places, if you come with your student ID, they won't even let you vote with a student ID, even if that's the only form of ID that you have at the moment. And you're a college student, right? And we know the finances that are centered around being a college student. And so there are things that are set in place so that some people can't vote. But at the same time, to push back on that comment around black people not voting, sir, ma'am, black people do vote, and black people not voting is not the issue. It's not that. It's not that.
It's the voter suppression that's going on. That's the issue.
I think we more so have to turn out though in our local races.
That's where the policies are made. Yeah.
Right. If there was a disparity, it would be in how we vote in countrywide races versus like statewide and city races, right? Mm-hmm. That's something different. Now we can have a conversation around local races, right? That's a conversation to be had.
That's a different show.
That's another thing, right? Like there's a disparity there, and I won't, leave that out. But also there's another thing called voter suppression, and that's not to make an excuse for people who can go out and vote, but voting by itself is not enough. And in economics, because I'm an economic development student as well, in economics, we talk about how voting only catches a snippet of people's preferences because it only takes a certain amount of the population, right? And it may, it may capture what they desire, but it doesn't capture how important they think that particular issue is, right? And so if you're voting, it doesn't measure how intense your passion is towards a certain issue. Right. And so voting also has its flaws. And that's the reason why we have politicians who are supposed to be, of a certain caliber to understand that regardless of whether people are voting for you or not, this is a moral issue and this is a health issue. And I hope that you vote the right way, but also understanding that it was a health issue when it was crack. Mm-hmm. Poverty is a health issue. And impoverished people.
So, I mean, with this whole opioid and crack issue, I know you and I, we're talking about it now. Some people are talking about it, but I don't think we're talking about it enough. I don't think we are fighting for it enough. I mean, yes, we can reach out to our local community leaders and get them to speak on our behalf, but what else can we do using our platforms, using our voices? Like, what I'm doing right now, I brought you on the show. This is me contributing in some way. What else can we really do to really get this topic? I mean, the New York Times had an op-ed about the opioid crisis.
I read that. I actually see it's the Random Hour. Okay, I see the Random Hour. It talked about how Black folks need to join caucuses that speaks for their best interests, big and small. And I totally agree with that. I couldn't agree with that before. I everything I've done has been through the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Florida. Like everything I've done, I'm not ashamed to say that, I am a caucus person all the way. I support things that affect Black issues. And I think sometimes we think that in order for us to have a big impact, we have to kind of cross over and be accepted by white politicians and do things that, we have to cross over and we have to compromise. And I think that we have to compromise when it benefits us, but also be just as radical as Tea Partiers are. And unfortunately, a lot of Black politicians kind of fall prey. I always say Black politicians don't equal Black policy. Black politicians and Black politics are different than Black policy. And Black policy happens when people understand that, you can win a campaign, but what policies are you pushing through? Like, instead of trying to make a deal to stay where you are, what policies are you pushing through and pushing for that affect only Black people? It's not wrong to say, this is a Black issue and I want y'all to pass it. Even if it does not. It's not wrong to stand up for that, right? Like, the civil rights movement was not happening, let's join hands with everybody else. Let's get together as folk to get our human rights back. And I think that we kind of got to approach it the same way. And I think as Black and brown people's economic statuses are different, we're allowed to live different places, we kind of lost like a unified message a little bit. And, you have different people that represent different regions of the diaspora. Everybody's not African American anymore in America that's Black. Everybody's not African that's Black. People are Hispanic. People are Chinese. People are all these different things. And so the people.
So we're being dissected into communities. But I think also, despite that, there's still a common goal. There's still issues that affect all of us, no matter. As long as you have melanin in you, issues like this.
Absolutely. And I think that that's another conversation that deserves its own like news show, because I have this theory that I think right now more than ever there is a political divide between folks of color And there's one thing if you're talking about us and the larger white construct that is America, but then if you bring it down to a micro level, different parts of that diaspora, different parts of the people of color community are dealing with different things. And as polarized as the Republicans and the Democrats are, you kind of see that same polarization, maybe on a smaller scale, is kind of happening within communities, right? Because African Americans face overwhelmingly different issues than, someone who may be Black and undocumented, right? Someone may be Haitian is facing, right? Or
I had a show 2 weeks ago on the same topic. I titled it Africans and African Americans in Chile Coexistence. I have snippets of it somewhere on my Instagram page, but pretty much.
And I'm going to go check that out because I do believe that there's going to call for more of a unity and more of an internal conversation. I think we have to stop having the conversation with like stop going on like the CNN shows and like trying to convince like white people that we are valuable and whatever. Right. We have to start having this conversation within ourselves because as an African American person, I started to have these conversations with folks in college who were Haitian and Nigerian and all these different things. And we have very different issues, but you're in a country where people consider you the same and people project like things off on you that are not yours to, carry. But I do think now with Trump in office, if it has not united us before, it definitely should.
It is uniting all of us.
Yeah,
and we have no choice.
I pray that it is. I pray that it is because Black folks and African Americans have been seeing this since we got here on the boat, right? So we can give y'all a pointer or two about how to endure these kind of issues, right? And so I think that the more we band together, the more we can kind of fight this thing and like stop looking at it as, well, that community over there is predominantly African American and like crack happens over there and it happens in the 80s. We weren't here yet, so we only over here trying to do our thing. And then you have like Hispanic people.
I wish I knew you when I had that show, the Africans and African Americans.
Oh my God. I would have been willing.
And there was a lot that we talked about that surrounded the stereotypes that Africans have of African Americans and vice versa. And we broke those down. Like Instagram had to kick me out after an hour. They had to.
Absolutely. I'm here to let anybody have it that needs it because I am African American, as far as I know. My family are we're part of the Lovings, like that famous Loving story where, the lady married the white guy in Virginia and it was a big issue and whatever. I'm also Claybrooks. I am from the, our folks are from the plantations of Tennessee. We came, up to Michigan to find a job in a Ford plant and we kind of populated from there up in the Midwest or whatever. So I understand.
Have you done your Ancestry.com to trace back a little bit more?
I'm going to go a little further. I've spent so much time being so proud of being, African American that I haven't really explored it that much. But I think this year, one of my things on my bucket is to figure out what part of, Africa my folks came from and also what part of the American, like what tribe they're from. I know my mom and my grandma, used to have a lot of talks about that and they had a lot of stories. But because I was adopted and off into foster care, that kind of created, a lot of discovery there. And so I have been on a mission the last couple of years to kind of figure that out. But I'm so, like, proud of, like, the culture that Black Americans have created in spite of slavery that I identify with that the most, right? So if you were to ask me...
Well, if there's anything I want you to walk away with talking about that topic, we are not different. We're not. There's not much of a
we're not. No, we're not. We're not. No, we're not. And it's crazy because for people who say that we are, I think that I'm not necessarily mad at Black folks who say that we are because that is internalized racism that was also created by colonization, right?
Exactly. But we are in a position where we can find that out by ourselves. I mean, for me, I was born in D.C. I grew up between D.C. and Nigeria. I have the Nigerian side, I have the American side of me. So there's really not much of a difference. It's only that we haven't been communicating, and there's been so many stereotypes. I mean, right now, everybody has been checking out their Ancestry.com and figuring out where they're from. At the end of the day, Africans are asking, okay, we've been trying to show and tell for very long. What happened? How come all of a sudden everybody wants to be African? But there were certain parts of the African culture Africans felt that African Americans didn't want to embrace. But again, I don't want to. Let's not, but it all comes down to breaking it down and understanding. Like, okay, I tell African people, people that are African from the diaspora, immigrants, look, listen. If somebody does their Ancestry.com and they reach out to you and say, oh, I found out I'm from Ghana, I found out I'm from Sierra Leone, don't shut them down. If they want to learn more about the culture, and that's what I believe Africans, some of us, are beginning to do. And then we can't dwell on the fact that, okay, yeah, once upon a time you didn't want to pronounce my name. Once upon a time you didn't want to learn something, but all of that is a conversation we need to have, pretty much.
Right, and I definitely think so. And I take time, and I think sometimes I surprise people as an African American person who is willing to, I was mad for a long time. I was like, everybody want to be everything but African American. It used to make me extremely upset, right? But for me, now I've gotten to the point where I recognize that there's so much work to do within the diaspora that we can't even waste energy trying to convince people without melanin that we're valuable, because there's so much work to do with it. I spend a lot of my time trying to have, if I'm sitting in the car with a cab driver or an Uber driver that's not from here, that's from Haiti, from Sierra Leone, from Ivory Coast, I have friends from there, I take that time to dispel that and have those hard conversations. And sometimes I walk away being the person uncomfortable, and sometimes other people are uncomfortable, but I'm always willing to have that conversation with folks, because I could spend my entire life being mad at the fact that African Americans are held at the lowest of the totem pole in the United States, or I can spend that time trying to A, be prideful and take pride in who I am, and then B, have those conversations with people who look like me and dispel those myths one person at a time, because that's really the only way it happens. And I don't sit, on a train, or I never, because a lot of times when I say I'm from Detroit, and I'll tell somebody, I've had people who are Black but not from the United States, and they'll be like, oh, you were born and raised here? Yeah. Well, I go to NYU. I'm a grad student. And they'd be surprised, right? Because I don't sound proper. I don't code switch or anything. So they're surprised at the fact that they met somebody authentic, but I'm now, I've gone through all these things and I'm in grad school. And I take those opportunities to say, hey, I'm not mad at you for that, because I understand where that comes from, but let's have a conversation and let's talk about how I feel and talk about how you feel. And I never waste an opportunity to do that, because it's important.
Yeah, and Jake made a comment. He said a lot of Black history has been lost for lack of pride, which is absolutely true. And that's something I didn't mention yet. So I talked about how the stereotypes that Africans feel that African Americans have about them, but at the same time, Africans coming from the continent, they come here and they look at African Americans and they say, okay, why are you doing a McDonald's job? And I come here and I'm in college and I'm getting a college degree. No. I've told my people we cannot do that,
Let me tell you something. That is the number one conversation I have. And so for folks who don't want to take my word for it, because, I'm Black and I'm proud and I'm all of that, right? But for folks who don't want to take my word for it, there's a book that's called Disintegration by Eugene Robinson. And he was a writer for the Washington Post, and he talks about the disintegration of Black America. He talks about the civil rights movement. He talks about the abandoned, which is folks who live in the ghetto and, who are poor. He talks about the emerging, which are folks who came here in the 60s and the 80s and the 70s who were Jamaican and from the Caribbean and from Africa, and what that started to look like. He talks about the upper echelon of Black folks, and he talks about all of that separation and how we kind of ended up where we are separated. But my biggest argument with that is that here in the United States, because I also used to work for Obamacare, right? And I used to do enrollment for the Virginia program. And I noticed that there are things written into certain laws and certain benefits that benefit folks who come here as immigrants that they wouldn't work out the same way for people who are born here that are African American, right? And in the United States, there are people don't understand the way it works systematically, right? Poverty was assigned to African American people in the United States for generations. Right. And it would be the same in another country. I've been to Venezuela and Panama and places like that, where even if the people look like you, it would be the same as like a class issue in another country. If your family is born poor, you will be poor for generations until somebody breaks that, or there's something that happens that breaks that. It's the same here in the United States. We have a lot of opportunity, but systematically things are assigned to us that that perpetuate like that poverty, right? So
and those are the kind of things immigrants do not understand, and that's why we need to have the conversation, because but you know, we can talk about this like literally all day, but that's definitely
read the book,
yes.
And I'll leave some folks with a little bit of numbers, right? So I attend NYU, New York University, right?
Right.
I am one of 4 African Americans that have been in the urban planning program since I've been at NYU. Now, there's a larger black population.
Yeah.
But 4 of us are African American. That leaves everybody else to be of other origins in the diaspora, right?
Exactly.
And so if there are more than 4 of us in the United States, then surely there could be more than 4 African Americans at NYU in the urban planning program when I came in, right? But you have to understand that, again, there's systematic things that happen. There's achievement gaps that happen. You know what I'm saying? There's a difference in values. There's a lack of confidence in what the government can do for you if you're born here. So I just kind of want to leave people with that to think about. Also leave people with like things that they know that they can do locally to combat the issue of you know, the crack epidemic or the opioid situation. If you know there's a plot of land that where a rehab can go and you're politically involved, let's start shooting for them to start building these institutions, right? Because they're going to build them in the suburbs. Oh, it's going to be some treatment centers in the suburbs. There's going to be some funding for some people to get treated in the suburbs. So we need to start, like, you know, attacking it from those kind of standpoints instead of being upset and like mad that they didn't hand us any reparations, because they have not done it since we've been here.
Exactly.
So let's start tackling it that way.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you. Yeah, Jake's made another comment. He said a lot of parts of our everyday life exist because of contributions blacks have made in our society. Absolutely. Without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt.
And anybody who thinks otherwise, I just pray that everybody who's been in on this like on our new show today are going back and having those conversations with their African American workers, if you're African or Caribbean or Hispanic, or, you know, African Americans are having these conversations in their barbershops or in their local businesses where people who are a part of the diaspora own them, but they're not, you know, necessarily African American. Like, we have to start having these conversations. It's high time that we start learning as African Americans what the conflicts are in predominantly black that bring people here, or what is it, you know, what's going on, right? Like, what are the tribal conflicts that are going on, right? And you know, Kenya, or what is the Eritrean versus Ethiopian conflict? What does that look like? And I think that there's just as much responsibility for us to try to figure that out as we try to place on other people to try to come over here and understand us, you know, whatever. So I think that those of us that have the privilege to get away from lives, those of us that are educated, because to be sitting where I'm sitting, taking to have this conversation is a privilege, right? It's a privilege that a lot of people who are in the hustle bustle of everyday life don't have. So let's acknowledge that first. But for those of us who do have the privilege of having an education, let's start digging deeper and actually have those conversations, right? And
have conversations that really matter, that impact the community. Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to thank you so much for being on the show, Brittany. We went past our 30-minute mark. I knew that was going to happen with a conversation like this.
Oh my God. Well, listen, I can talk about this for days. I'm passionate about us, our people. I'm passionate about the things that affect us, you know, so I could talk about it for days. We can pay Instagram to give us another hour if we had to, but we don't have that kind of time. But I really appreciate you. I really appreciate you for reaching out to me and recognizing, you know, the need for this conversation when we talked last week. I mean, it happened so quick. I'm just like,
it did happen so quickly. And I'm glad you were able to come on the show as quickly as we talked about it last week. That if you know anybody in the community doing great work that wants to come on the show and talk about what they do and how we can start having conversations about how to impact the community, please have them, contact me so we can get them on the show. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in as well.
God, thanks, everybody.
Your input was great today, like always, anyways, because without